Good morning. My name is Ole Høy Jakobsen, and today I'm here to tell you a little bit about the Science-Based Targets Initiative. But before I begin, I want to give you a quick introduction to myself and the company that I work at. I am a manager at Nordic Sustainability. We are a consultancy and we work at the intersection between sustainability and strategy. And our tagline is, strategy should be built on sustainability. What's the alternative? We are Copenhagen-based. We work with both the public and the private sector, and as you can see from below, we work with companies such as Hempel and Coloplast, but also great organizations such as the Nordic Council of Ministers and UN Global Compact. I myself manage strategy projects and greenhouse gas accounting projects and working with Hempel and DRIF. Before I joined Nordic Sustainability back in March 2020, I was working in London for a great organization called the Climate Group, which is an NGO that deals with climate change and increasing climate action with both companies and subnational governments. I have quite a bit of material that I would like us to go through today. The presentation is only set for half an hour, but if you do have any questions, then put it in the Q&A box, and I will try my best to get back to you after the webinar is over, because I don't think we're going to have time during this webinar here. So the agenda for today is that I'm going to tell you a bit about what the Science-Based Target Initiative is. I'm going to talk about why companies should consider setting science-based targets, how they actually go about doing it, and then finally where to go from there. So what is the Science-Based Target Initiative? Well, it was set up in 2015 by 4 excellent climate-focused organizations called CDP, WWF, World Resources Institute, and UN Global Companies, UN Global Compact. And it was simply done so to get companies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in line with what is required by science. And what does that mean? Well, first of all, a science-based target is a short to medium-term target. It's only a target for 5 to 15 years, and it is basically to get companies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And it's science-based if it's in line with the decarbonization that is required to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees. So in a nutshell, science-based targets is just a target that companies set to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's it. The good thing about science-based targets, because there is a lot of other greenhouse gas reductions programs out there, and many of them are absolutely excellent. But the good thing about science-based targets is that it's a very holistic target. It focuses on all of your emissions throughout your operations and your value chain, which makes it a very credible program, in my opinion. And you don't have to just take my word for it. Today, there's more than 1,000 companies who've committed to science-based targets, and more than 500 of those companies have already developed targets in line with science. So why should a company consider setting a science-based target? Well, hopefully most of the people here on the webinar already know that climate change is happening. It's very real, and it's happening faster than we like. We have less than 10 years to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 45%. And we know that businesses have a key role to play. So they are, of course, the drivers of a lot of the innovation that we need, but they are also the source of quite a few of these greenhouse gas emissions. But companies don't have to set science-based targets just from the good of their hearts. Science-Based Target Initiative made some research and asked a lot of the company execs at the companies who set science-based targets about their experience with setting these targets. And there came some really interesting findings from that. And 55% of these people saw improved profitability and competitiveness simply by having a more efficient business model. So when you set science-based target, you have to use only the materials that you need in order to emit as few greenhouse gases as possible, and that's a benefit to your business. Science-based targets is also becoming quite a popular program among investors. And just by setting a science-based target, because the rules and requirements are quite strict, then investors can be certain that companies who are doing it are actually making a good difference. So it boosts investor confidence. When you set science-based targets, you are doing it in line with science, so you are making proper greenhouse gas reductions, and they are based on the same models that governments are basing their calculations on of how much greenhouse gases needs to be reduced. So if you go on the path of science-based targets, you should be on the same path as governments are trying to put everybody else on. So it reduces regulatory uncertainty. And finally, I'd love to tell you that setting science-based targets and delivering science-based targets is easy. It's not completely easy. You need to develop the ways that you do business, and in some ways that causes you to drive innovation. And as you can see, nearly 2/3 of the people asked says that setting science-based targets actually drive a really positive innovation within the company. So it's quite a few good reasons to set a science-based target. So how does one actually go about doing it? Well, looking at this, it's actually quite simple. There's 5 basic steps to set a science-based target. First, you need to commit to setting science-based target. You do that to the Science-Based Target Initiative. And that process is simply just signing a commitment letter where you give a little bit of information about your company and a little bit of information about the people who is going to be working on it. But that's it. And then after that, you have 2 years until you need to finish the next phase, and that is developing your target. And developing your target is the most comprehensive part of the science-based target process, and also what we're going to be spending most of our time speaking about here today. After the 2 years is over, or even before that, if you're fast, you submit your target to the Science-Based Target Initiative, who then has to approve the target. You have 2 goals included in a price where you get feedback after submitting your science-based target each time in case there's any changes that need to be made. But most companies get through it all right, and then after they've submitted and got the target approved, then they can communicate about it. And that is, of course, what a lot of companies like to do, because then they get to tell their investors and their other stakeholders that now they've set a science-based target and are reducing their greenhouse gas emission in line with what is required by science. The final bit is that you need to disclose. So you need to disclose on your progress to the Science-Based Target Initiative every year, just to make sure that you are making progress. And if you're not making progress, then what can we do to ensure that that actually happens? But as I said, developing the target is one of the main things of this process. So we're going to be speaking a little bit about that now. There's 3 key elements to developing a science-based target. The first thing is that you need to understand your carbon footprint, and that is the emissions that you have within your own operations, and then the emissions that you have in your value chain. So that's from your suppliers and your customers. And what you need to understand is, what is your total carbon footprint? What is your carbon intensity? So let's say that you are a company that creates televisions, then how much carbon do you emit per unit of televisions produced, per television that you produce? Where are the emission hotspots in your value chain? That means that you might have a certain place, you might be using a lot of carbon when to extract the materials that you need to build your TV, so on. And then finally, how much will your business grow? Because as I said, science-based targets is a target that you set for the next 5 to 15 years. So you need to have an idea about what your business is going to look like at that time. The next element of setting a science-based target is choosing the right emissions scenario. And the Science-Based Target Initiative gives you 2 different options. There's the well below 2 degrees options. And here companies will have to reduce their annual greenhouse gas emissions by roughly 2.5%. And then there's the more ambitious version, which is the 1.5 degrees model, where companies have to reduce their annual emissions by 4.2%. And finally, the last element of setting a science-based target is choosing the right approach. And this may be where science-based targets can seem more complicated and get a little bit geeky, because this is choosing the right methodology in doing so. But it's actually quite a nice feature of science-based targets, because it allows companies to create science-based targets in a way that makes sense for their type of business. And there's three different options. There's the absolute contraction approach, the sectoral decarbonization approach, and the economic-based approach. But diving into this a little bit more, many of you might have seen this figure on the left-hand side before. This figure here is developed by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is sort of the Bible of greenhouse gas accounting. If you haven't seen it before, then no worries, that's completely fine. I recently saw a report from KPMG and FSR, Danish auditors, that said that only 12% of large Danish companies are reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions based on the methodology from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So if you haven't heard about it, that's absolutely fine. But if you are considering setting science-based targets, then you will use the framework for from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So it's worth getting used to. And what this figure actually shows is up in the cloud, you have the 7 greenhouse gases that needs to be covered if your company emits it. For most companies, then it will only be a few of these, simply because you don't emit some of them. And for most companies, CO2 will be the vast majority of your total emissions. The bottom part of the figure shows the way that emissions are divided in order to avoid double counting, simply to ensure that we are counting all the emissions the right number of times. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol calls their division scopes, and there are 3 of these scopes. Scope 1 covers direct emissions, that is emissions from sources that the company owns or controls. That could, for instance, be the emissions that comes from fuel burned in company cars. In Scope 2, we have emissions that comes from the energy that companies buy. So that could, for instance, be the emissions that are burned in a power plant when a utility generates the electricity that a company consumes. And then finally, we have Scope 3. And Scope 3 covers indirect emissions that are everything else than what is covered in Scope 2. So if we use the example of a company developing TVs again, then Scope 3 will cover the extraction of materials that goes into producing the TV. And it will cover the emissions of getting the company's employees into work to actually build the TV or sell the TV. And then it will also cover the emissions that comes from the electricity that your customers are consuming to watch the TV. So Scope 3 covers quite a few different things. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has identified 15 different categories that cover different aspects of Scope 3. And this might seem a little bit complex and a little bit complicated, but in reality, there are some excellent resources out there developed by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, where I've shown you the front pages of 4 of these reports. There's quite a bit of reading in it, but it is very straightforward and something that a lot of people can do. So please don't be scared about this. It is very doable. Then it's important to understand that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol only tells you how to account for your greenhouse gas emissions. And on top of that, then science-based targets tells you what to include and what not to include in order to actually make this target here. And the Science-Based Target Initiative have developed a guide with criteria and recommendations. There are 24 criteria and 13 recommendations. So there's some really good help there about what you can do and what you can't do. But a spoiler for you, 95%, at least 95% of your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions need to be covered when you're setting a science-based target. That is quite nice. That means that if you have some operations somewhere in a country really far away where it's very difficult to get the data that you need, that is not a significant part of your overall operations, then you can exclude that and focus on the bits that really matter. But you need to include at least 95% of your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And if you have a company that is like a lot of other companies where most of your emissions comes from this great chunk of Scope 3 emissions, if it covers at least 40% of your total emissions, then you need to include at least 2/3 of your total Scope 3 emissions. Most companies will have the majority of their emissions in Scope 3. So unless you are a utility that has a lot of power plants that burns a lot of fossil fuels to generate electricity, or maybe you're a transport company that have a lot of company vehicles that are driving goods around for your customers, then a lot of your emissions will be in Scope 3 and will likely have to be covered in your science-based target. And then it's also important that science-based target does require you to include all 7 greenhouse gases that are included in the greenhouse gas protocol. But again, there's good guidelines of how to go about in doing that. Then there's also some things that science-based targets says that you cannot do. And I think that's important because right now we are seeing quite a few companies who are saying that they're dealing with climate change simple by going out and planting trees. This is called an offset mechanism where they don't reduce a lot of the emissions from within their own value chain. They're simply trying to change something outside of their value chain or plant trees or whatever. And it's important to understand that in science-based targets, then your emissions reductions does need to come from within your own value chain. So you do need to reduce your own emissions. Planting trees is good, but it won't count toward your science-based targets. And the same if you're a producer of, let's say, solar panels or wind turbines, then it would be nice to say that by our customers using these solar panels or these wind turbines, we are saving the world for quite a bit of CO2. Again, that is great, but it doesn't count towards you achieving your science-based target. The second element, as I said, was to choose the right emission scenario. And as I said, there are 2 different options. There's the 1.5 degree model and there's the well below 2 degree model. There actually used to be a third one, which was a 2 degree model as well, but that has now been removed because the organizations behind science-based target thought that it's simply not ambitious enough anymore. And I think last time I checked, then it was almost 400 of the 500 companies that have set their science-based target already that are on the 1.5 degree pathway. And I know that some of the 2 degree ones are thinking about changing to the 1.5 degree pathway. So it's important to understand that changing to or using the 1.5 degree model is the new norm, and that is the more ambitious one. And some of you may ask, why should we go with the 1.5 degree model or when we can choose the well below 2 degree model? And I think a lot of companies have found their answer in the report that was developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was released in 2018, that amongst other things explained the differences of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And a few of those findings are here to the left. Global sea level rise would be 10 centimeters lower with global warming of 1.5 degrees than 2 degrees. That is on average, so that means certain times of the year it would be a higher sea level rise in certain locations around the world. It would be a higher sea level rise. So this would have massive impact on flooding around the world, which is of course not nice. The very scary thought of having Arctic Ocean free of sea ice would only happen once per century at 1.5 degrees, but once per decade at 2 degrees. And finally, coral reefs would decline by 70 to 90% with global warming of 1.5 degrees. That is, of course, really a lot, but they would be virtually all gone if we reach 2 degrees. So there's a lot of reasons why to go with the 1.5 degree pathway instead of the 2 degree pathway. And then we get to this geeky thing that I told you about just before. I've included this figure because I think it gives a nice overview about the flexibility of the science-based target setting process here. And I've included 2 of the different models here. We have the absolute-based approach on the left-hand side and the sector-based approach on the right-hand side. And the key difference is that in the absolute-based approach, then every company has to reduce their emissions by the same amount. So again, for the well below 2 degree pathway, that is 2.5% annually, and at the 1.5 degree pathway, then it is reducing emissions by 4.2% annually. And then there's this sector-based approach, and the sector-based approach works a little bit differently. So the International Energy Agency has developed carbon budgets for each sector, which basically means how much carbon are a specific sector allowed to emit in order to stay within 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees. And then by using those carbon budgets, then we have a pretty good idea about, if we know the demand, an estimated demand of how many units of the thing that a company produces is. Let's say that it's concrete and we need, let's say, millions of tons of concrete. Then we also know roughly how much carbon can go into producing each ton of this concrete. So if you are a company who today uses quite a bit of CO2 to produce 1 ton of concrete, then you will have to reduce, then you are company A, and then you will have to reduce your emissions by more than a company who is currently not using a whole lot of CO2 to create 1 ton of concrete, company C. So it shows that there are some differences in the approaches that you can choose to go with. The Science Based Targets initiative recommends that you go with the more ambitious approach. But you can see what works well for your company, and there are extra guidelines for the sectoral approach. So getting to what does this then actually look like? So after you have developed your target, and then hopefully you will get your target approved, and it might not seem like a lot, but this is actually what you're working towards. So I've brought 2 examples. We have Novo Nordisk, who commits to reduce its scope 1 and 2 emissions by 100% by 2030 from a 2018 base year, and they also commit to having their key suppliers, 300 of their suppliers, which represent 2/3 of their scope 3 emissions, which is what you need to cover with science-based targets, will have set greenhouse gas reduction targets by 2030 in line with what is required by science. And this is, according to the Science Based Target Initiative, what you need to be on a pathway towards 1.5 degrees. So that is really nice. It also shows the difference in targets that you can set for scope 3. So target for scope 3 can both be reducing total emissions, but it can also be working with suppliers and customers to get them to set targets in line with what is required by science-based targets, because then they will also reduce their emissions, which in line with what is required by science. So it's that is a very good path forwards, and also gives some flexibility with Science-Based Target Initiative. And then the other example is Ørsted. Ørsted commits to reduce its scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 98% per kilowatt hour by 2025 from 2006 base year, and commits to reduce absolute scope 3 emissions by 50% by 2032 from a 2018 base year. So that shows that Ørsted has chosen to go with the absolute scope 3 emissions reductions instead of working directly with, instead of basing their target on suppliers setting their target. So there's some flexibility there, which is nice. Finally, so this is the process of setting science-based targets, and the slide before showed you what you're hoping to get your target approved by science-based target and what it can look like. I've included this bit here in the presentation as well, because right now we are seeing a lot of companies setting a carbon neutrality target or net zero emissions targets. And that is great. That is exactly what everyone should be going for. But right now there's no specific framework or no specific guidelines or rule book for how to develop a carbon neutrality target. And therefore, quite a few companies are simply looking at how many greenhouse gas emissions they have, and then they go out and then they plant the equivalent amount of trees to say that, okay, I have now reduced my emissions by planting trees. That is, it's good. We need to plant more trees, but unfortunately, then that doesn't get us the whole way. And right now, the Science Based Target Initiative is developing a framework, some better guidelines, a rule book for what carbon neutrality looks like, and that will likely be finalized by the end of 2021. So they've already developed one report about some of the things that's going to go into it, and one of the things that we can see is that companies will have to focus on reducing emissions from within their own value chain. They will have to reduce their own emissions. Planting trees is not enough. It is a really important part of the process, but you only offset, you only plant trees to the equivalent of your last residual emissions that you simply can't get rid of because it's the technology to get rid of them is simply not there, or you don't have adequate control over the things where you need to reduce your emissions, or maybe it is so financially stupid to do it with the last few emissions that it simply doesn't make sense. Those emissions you can offset, but the rest of it you need to reduce yourself within your own value chain. And I'd like to say that then creating the science-based target is the most complicated part, but setting the science-based target is setting the target. After that, you need to go out and reduce your emissions. But I want to leave you on a very positive note, because there are quite a few things that companies can do in order to reduce their emissions that are very economical, simply makes business sense. And I've presented 3 of them here for you. There is the first recommendation from me to you is to increase your energy efficiency. The cheapest energy is the energy you don't have to buy. And many companies have found that simply by reducing their energy consumption, then they're saving money that can be used for other carbon reducing initiatives. So it's a really good place to start. And then use renewable electricity. I would recommend that everyone sets a 100% renewable electricity target. The price of both solar and wind is dropping year on year. It's getting cheaper, and in many countries around the world, it's already the cheapest source of electricity. So it makes sense to do it, but it's also something about pushing the boundaries. There's certain countries around the world where it's still difficult to source renewable electricity as a company. By joining the wave of company who is setting 100% renewable electricity target, you're really pushing the boundaries of what's possible today. So you're part of the good development. And finally, switch to electric vehicles. Transport is the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions. Today, it covers about 23% of global energy related emissions. That will continue to grow, and switching to electric vehicles is a really good way to mitigate that. Many people will say that switching to an electric vehicle costs more, and that is true. For the same class of vehicle, then when you buy it, then the electric vehicle will cost a little bit more. However, that price is dropping year on year because the battery gets cheaper to produce. But also owning an electric car is actually quite a bit cheaper than owning a petrol or diesel car, simply because it's cheaper to charge it / fuel it. And it also has much fewer parts, so it needs to go into the garage a whole lot less. That was everything from me this morning. Thank you so much for spending time with me. If you have any questions about science-based targets or anything that I said in this presentation, then please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you so much for participating, and I hope that you have a really nice Tuesday. Thank you.